With the last lecture, I continue to explore the methodological potential of reading absence in analyzing and interpreting works of art that remain as my focus. So today's topic is about contemporary art. I moved from like ancient time sewn pillows to 17th century to contemporary times. But there is a changing focus. I'm thinking about methodology, so I try to use absence as a central theme. So the first lecture, actually, I didn't focus on particular period, and I focused on this object, the relationship between object-subject with broad issues. And second lecture, I did focus on particular period, which is 17th century, between Ming and Qing dynasty. And today, actually, although I focus on contemporary time, but my real focus is really to test the usefulness of this concept in writing some kind of historical narrative. It's not really about the in history, but as a kind of narrative device. So let me try. I said that all three lectures are work in progress. Basically, they contribute to two-book project, and this one is really something about history of contemporary art. Okay. This lecture has two specific contexts in relation to the study of contemporary art, which differs from the study of art of past in many ways. So let me first explain these two contexts. The first of these two contexts is the current discussion about the concept of a contemporary, the concept of contemporary. What is contemporary art? Although the term contemporary art has been around for quite a while and now has the titles of numerous museums, journals, and books, serious inquiry into its nature and the theoretical components just begin, not just in Chinese art, but also in what is contemporary art. And so a clear sign of this emerging interest is a series of workshops, symposium discussions, panel discussions since, I believe, 2009. The first major one was in Clark Institute, Williams College. And after that, there have been a number of these, just talking about what is contemporary art, what is contemporaneity. Despite the conventional and still dominant view that contemporary art is the proper province of critics, the organizers of these events often claim that it should also be the subject of historical and theoretical inquiry. Their confidence, I believe, lies in the simple fact that contemporary art has indeed left measurable historical tracks which can be traced to at least the 1960s in the West and to the 1980s in China and some other place. These different datings imply a basic premise behind any attempt to forge historical narratives of contemporary art. That is, contemporary art is from the beginning plural and diverse. It's not a single one. From beginning plural, multiple, and diverse. It is not only located in different places, but also conditioned by different art traditions, historical experiences, and social environments. Meanwhile, the increasing tide of globalization has created innumerable ties to connect separate contemporary art practices. We recognize this reality in more than 100 biennales and triennials around the world, the expansion of powerful transnational art galleries and auction houses, and journals and magazines covering contemporary art events on a global scale. So on the one hand, there's locality and different temporality. On the other hand, this increasing tide of globalization bring everything together. So instead of producing unified standards in evaluation and interpretation, however, the global circulation of artworks, artists, curators, and exhibitions is simultaneously recontextualized within special locales and diasporas, thereby legitimating the seemingly paradoxical concept of contemporary Chinese art. Not just contemporary, but also Chinese. I remember that several years ago, after giving a talk, I was asked how an art could be both contemporary and Chinese. The person who asked this question clearly found these two concepts incompatible. But for those who do believe that contemporary art has multiple and distinct localities and histories, it is only natural that it should be defined historically and contextually. In the various junctures of the global and the local, and in the incessant temporal and spatial movements of images, concepts, and people in interconnected but never identical cultural circles. So that's the first context. My talk will respond to this discussion: what is contemporary art and what is Chinese contemporary art? The second context of this talk is an ongoing effort to write a history or histories of contemporary Chinese art. This art is still young, so such an effort to write history have also just begun. When I was compiling this book, I put it here, called the Contemporary Chinese Art Primary Documents, a volume commissioned by MoMA New York and published 2 years ago. I started the book with this observation I read. That was 2 years ago. During the past 20 to 30 years, contemporary Chinese art has emerged as one of the liveliest and most creative trends within international contemporary art. Many exhibitions have introduced this art to a global audience, and the number of publications about it has also grown rapidly. Except in few cases, however, most of these publications are exhibition catalogs and picture albums. No systematic introduction to contemporary Chinese art has yet been written in any Western language, and nearly all the relevant primary documents exist only in Chinese and are scattered in hard-to-find publications. So that's why we did this volume, basically try to select the key writings by artists, by critics, by whoever, even the government, since the late 1970s, and translate them into English, so people here can use these primary data in the research, teaching, and studying, including students. So that was a major purpose. Happily, this statement I just read is no longer true today. Not only does the MoMA volume now offer English translations of original documents organized in a historical framework. It's not just scattered documents. Actually, there is already a historical framework. But two books by Lu Peng and Gao Minglu, each describe the history of contemporary Chinese art in considerable detail. However, I should also make it clear that neither book just focus on contemporary art alone, but rather frame contemporary art within 20th century Chinese art. They're both about 20th century Chinese art. But the part about contemporary art is quite substantial. Comparing these three publications, we find similar historical contours, but marked differences in definition and the interpretation of key or historical phenomena. An important factor underlying such differences is the author's different takes on the notion and the expression of the contemporary. For example, when did a split between the contemporary and the modern occur in Chinese art? It's quite two different fabrics and concepts. When this split occur, what are the symptoms and the consequence of this split? Does the departure from the modern indicate a new historical consciousness and self-awareness on the part of the artist, or just a theoretical framing? How does artistic creativity reflect or help construct the notion of contemporary? Different answers to these questions, though not always explicit, necessarily influence, even determine how one tells the history or story of contemporary Chinese art. It is at this juncture that I can put forth my 3 goals in this lecture. In the next 40 minutes or so, I will first investigate the emergence of contemporary as a discursive term in early 1990s China. So you trace the literature, you find that this term actually emerged exactly in earlier 1990s. And I will examine what this historical shift, this new term, might signify. That's the first purpose. I will then trace the concept of contemporary to a group of art projects in the second half of the 80s. Considered milestones in the history of contemporary Chinese art, these projects have been interpreted as a product of a modern art movement called the 85 Art New Wave. I will explain later. A careful reading of these artworks, however, reveal a quite a different direction from the common characterization of the New Wave movement, as fueled by exuberant avant-gardism and collectivism. These art projects were all attempted by individual artists, not by groups or by movements, sometimes in prolonged solitude. So, I will explain. Actually, this art project in late 80s is quite different from our common notion of this new movement. More closely connected to the theme of this lecture series, nearly all of them, these art projects from late 80s, embrace the notion of absence by erasing legible signs, tangible images, concrete objects, and the distinct temporality. We'll see that. I'll give you an example. The result was a sharp rupture that is strictly temporary and contemporary by this erasure. So how do we explain this phenomenon? My answer is that instead of endorsing the modernist agenda of the New Wave movement, these works should be thought of as critical reflections on the movement as a signal that a contemporary turn was beginning in the late 1980s. In the last part of the talk, I will leap to the mid to late 90s, that's the third part, to analyze the parallel phenomenon. By this time, mid to late 90s, a new generation of experimental Chinese artists had emerged. They re-embraced the idea of absence as a conceptual and stylistic basis of their representations of the city and themselves. But what they reacted against was a different historical situation in which infant contemporary Chinese art was rapidly becoming a global commodity and threatened to lose its self-reflectivity. So I will do these 3 parts. Now begin the first part. Since not everyone here is familiar with the history of contemporary Chinese art, I should provide some background information. Briefly, the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976 cut off China and Chinese art from any outside influence. Western-style modern art, called 现代艺术 in Chinese, was banned from all exhibitions and publications. The 10 years, 60 to 70. Chinese art and visual culture was dominated by a heavy-handed ideology with the images of Mao and the revolutionary masses filling all exhibition spaces and the print culture media. But soon after Mao died in 1976 and the Cultural Revolution was over, a new unofficial art emerged in major cosmopolitan centers and eventually developed into a nationwide movement around the mid-80s. So this is 79, all events, 3 actually different unofficial exhibitions. One is very famous called STARS exhibition, taking place outside the National Museum. That's the official headquarters of this governmental sponsor art. So the artists put their works on the fence outside. They're very famous. This kind of alternative positioning emerged. That's the first photography show. So in the Sun Zhongshan Park, you can see it's so crowded. The art actually just some art photography, portraiture, not political at all. Then this no-name exhibition. That's the beginning. That's the beginning of this alternative, non-official, avant-garde, and contemporary art, we may say that. So these early events lead to this movement in the mid-80s. During this movement, known as the 85 Art New Wave, more than 100 art societies and collectives emerged all over the country. At the forefront of this movement was a group of young art critics who consider themselves leaders of a delayed modernization movement which they traced to the early 20th century in famous May 4th movement. They held that this historical modernization movement has started in early 20th century in May 4th movement in 1919 with the goal of transforming China based on the Western Enlightenment model. They also held that this modernization project was never completed in China because of the interruption of the wars and then the communist revolution. So in the design of these young artists, the young critics, the main purpose of this 85 Art New Wave was to reconnect Chinese art with the tradition of modern art and to reestablish the pivotal position of modern humanism and individualism in artistic creation, so totally modernist idea. Influenced by this line of thinking and the new culture fever at the time in the early 80s, many artists in this new wave movement eagerly embraced the newly translated Western literature and philosophy and made works based on reproduced Western images, which had become widely available at the time. So at the time, it's really a lot of things was translated. That was an absolutely important period of these translations. And so here is some very important leaders of movement, Gao Minglu himself, and many others. Those are publications. You can see the design is very interesting. This journal is called the Trend of Thought, 美术思潮, based in Hubei. So in the middle is the symbol of the whole country. It's a sculpture in front of Tiananmen in Tiananmen Square. Surrounded, you can see what is that, Rodin's thinker. So they position themselves as thinkers, thinking about the whole country, the history, and the whole art history. So that sort of symbolize. So that's from the criticism, and they also, historians, they begin to write a new history. But from the artist side, they begin to imitate this Western art, because many of the surrealism, other things were pop even, were reproduced and introduced to China at this time. So providing models for the young artists to follow. Styles and theories that long have been eclipsed in the West were used by these artists as their direct models. The meaning of their works here as modern art was located not in the original historical significance of the different styles and ideas, but in the transference, dislocation of these styles and ideas to a different time and place. So that period was so interesting because all these Western philosophy, art, art criticism were translated into China almost simultaneously. So the whole 100 years of Chinese, Western, this history, intellectual history, art history was compressed into a single moment. So you can see all these different styles. So for the artists, the historical relationship between those styles, it doesn't matter. The one matter is that they were from outside. They represent a sense of newly gained kind of individuality and modernity. Well, the New Wave movement had a relatively clear starting date, around 1985, with nearly simultaneous emergence of dozens of art groups, and eventually more than 100. It isn't clear when this movement ended. The confusion is partly caused by the timing of an important exhibition in 1989, called China Avant-Garde in English, and 现代美术大展, or a grand exhibition of modern art in Chinese. This was the final project of the New Wave movement. To an outsider, this date, 1989, seems to imply the continuation of the movement from 85 to 89. The problem, however, is that the exhibition was actually planned in 1986 and delayed several times due to unfavorable political conditions. When it finally opened in February 1989, even some of its organizers complained about the works in the show. Some of them they consider totally dated. So the show is very interesting show. The artist occupies the National Gallery and turned into almost like a funerary size. So with the black banners and with the symbol is a traffic symbol, just no U-turn, no U-turn. So signaling there is no turning back. So there's a feeling of some kind of tragic heroism there. And this feeling was closely related to the political situation of the time. You remember 89, right? The show was held in February. So 3 or 4 months after the exhibition, the Tiananmen student demonstration took place and ended in bloodshed. So that show and these events were actually conducted. And it turned out the art exhibition happened first, leading to this point. So that's a part of the student demonstration. You can see the symbol of this art exhibition was held, and actually statue was made by students in Central Academy of Fine Arts. So this 89 was a very important date. Chinese art after 1989 had a very different appearance. The energy of an organized avant-garde movement was entirely gone, just immediately, entirely gone. In its place emerged decentralized art projects conducted by individual artists or a few like-minded people. Instead of recapturing the spirit of mass movement, independent critics and curators now dedicated themselves to establishing a commercial infrastructure for unofficial art. This was also the moment when this art began to attract global attention, appearing in important international exhibitions as well as major Western newspapers and magazines. It was exactly around this time, starting from the early 90s, that the term 当代艺术 or contemporary art popped up on book covers and in exhibition titles, replacing 现代 or modern to become the preferred word for what was new, novel, and cosmopolitan. So here just basically some documents from that period. So this so-called art party by 2 very famous avant-garde artists, you can see actually was held in embassy. It's not in Tiananmen Square any place, Western venues. Here is a new journal established by exactly the same group of art critics But right now, they emerge art market and organize venues to promote the commercial venue. Here is Venice Biennale. This Li Xianping and all these artists appeared in the Venice Biennale for the first time. So that's early 90s. Turn away from this domestic contact to the global one. And this time, this idea of contemporary art became crucial. Okay, that's the context. So although this term appeared, but what does it mean? Reading documents from the period early 90s, one gets the feeling that the term contemporary art quietly emerged on its own without any particular theoretical articulation or political endorsement. Instead of proclaiming a consensual agenda as modern had done, the new term contemporary seems to defy any ideological or political commitment. That's a very interesting phenomenon. Even in Western contemporary, I feel there's this tendency. It's not very traceable. What does exactly mean? It's very little theoretical work, really, from that period talking about this. Many writers have tried to explain the difference between 80s and 90s Chinese art. These are two books. You see it's Contemporary Art, 1992, and the Modern Art, Contemporary Art, 1992. So many writers have tried to explain the difference between 80s and 90s Chinese art. Some have attributed the changes to the new political and the economic environment of the 90s. Others have emphasized the impact of the intensifying globalization process. In my view, these are all very important contextual factors, but the changing designation of unofficial art from modern to contemporary points to an internal shift in the artists' and the critics' vision of this art and of themselves. It's almost like a symbolic gesture. I would further suggest that this shift didn't occur suddenly in the early 90s as a direct consequence of the Tiananmen incident and the globalization. A re-examination of Chinese art from 86 to 89, a project which I have been pursuing these past few years in collaboration with some Chinese scholars, has begun to show a picture which is far more complex than previously painted, just about the 80s. Now I try to move back to the 80s and re-examine what's happening in the 80s, and I found the picture was not that simple. From 86 to 89, not just straightforward, big movement there. Actually, is quite complex. In this newly emerging picture, the overall modern identity and agenda of the new wave movement appears to be a theoretical construct articulated by the academic leaders of the movement. The actual movement had much more complex components and diverse directions. That's sort of a conclusion we try to. So sort of this modern thing or something is very much due to this kind of articulation and the idealization and this theoretical construction. But the actual artworks, when you look at them, are much more complex. Moreover, almost as soon as the new wave movement started in mid-80s and was entrusted with a general modernist mission, it immediately produced not only simulations of Western images, but also deconstructions of a wide range of existing images, both Western and Chinese. There are some works that we explain later. That's basically all works from 80s. I showed you some kind of more like an imitation of Western works, but then later I will focus on this group. These are not exactly the imitation. Actually, a series of very, very good deconstruction works of Chinese and Western images. Although most unofficial artists during this period started as members of avant-garde groups, some of them soon developed projects that defied the prescribed direction of the movement and distinguished themselves as individual artists. As I mentioned earlier, many of these individual projects they did embrace the idea of absence by erasing readable text, tangible images, concrete objects, and any distinct temporality. Together, these projects demonstrate a powerful shift from asserting a fixed ideological position to erasing the meaning of any given form. This shift then resulted in many, I will repeat the word empty signs, later will say, with the goal of restore a ground zero in artistic creation. A forerunner of this trend is Guan Yi. So, let me see. Guan Yi, here is the name. Most people know his later political pop paintings from the early 90s, but his most creative years were actually in the mid to late 1980s. In 1984, he co-founded the Northern Art Group in Northeast China and emerged as a key advocate of the 85 Art New Wave. He was then a passionate reader of Western modern philosophy and referenced the famous works from Western art in his early paintings. But even in its heyday, the Northern Art Group championed the aesthetic of they call the frozen north, and created still and dark images that rejected any revolutionary passion. Guan Yi's painting, in particular, appropriated famous images in Western art history, a tendency which further led him to superimpose geometric grids on semi-abstract shapes. So these two periods in his work, he started like 86, 87, this kind of appropriation of the famous images already pretty good, and superimpose them to the and that. According to himself, the grids we see here signify rational analysis aimed at discarding humanist sentiment, get away the humanist sentiment, and any belief system. So he basically inserted a layer between the image and the viewer. But the images he had already appreciated. So it's a kind of double negation in a way. First, he limited such analysis, this kind of analysis, to Western classical examples. You can see the model sort of in this. First up here, basically the image underneath from Western models. A turning point was reached in 1988 when he subjected Mao Zedong to such analysis, finally resulting in two series of large Mao portraits in red and gray. Modeled on Mao's official visage on Tiananmen, the portraits appear beneath grids of straight lines. Such grids were a conventional means to enlarge Mao's portrait during the Cultural Revolution, but they had now risen from underneath the painted surface to constitute a non-traversable barrier between Mao and the audience. I don't know, all these images, even that, they first, you draw the images, translate a picture to an image, you have to first make the grids, then make a larger image based on that. But in this painting, this grids seems surfaced from beneath and separating the image and the audience. These paintings have been mistakenly interpreted in the West as Wang's expression of anti-communist liberalism. But as the critic Huang Zhuan has argued, their real target was actually humanist passion, called 人文热情 in Wang Guangyi's own words, in any mass movement, including the 85 Art New Wave itself. So it's also a kind of self-criticism. He just rejects all this idea of a movement, a mass movement, avant-gardism, and use analysis, this as a sort of symbol. Also from 1986, there's some other artists, including Wen Dagu, Xu Bing, and Wu Shanzhuan, three young artists who soon become major representatives of contemporary Chinese art, started to deconstruct Chinese written language by filling their works with fake characters, creating various kinds of empty linguistic signs, which have been called pseudo-writing or anti-writing. So that's the three artists. They simultaneously begin to do this kind of work. These are fake characters. These are not readable real characters. So it's a very interesting movement. Significantly, all three artists abandoned any Western model and found their materials in indigenous sources. That's 86, very early. Yeah, it paralleled with this so-called new wave. Among them, Wu Shanzhuan's work evokes the visuality of the Cultural Revolution, but turned big character posters and the revolutionary stamps and slogans into illegible signs. Xu Bing and Wen Dagu were known for their familiarity with the traditional aesthetics. Gu Wenda created a series of pseudo-calligraphy. That's Wen Dagu or Gu Wenda, series called pseudo-calligraphy, using trained brushwork. And Xu Bing invented and carved several thousand characters to print beautiful traditional style books. So underlying this individual project was a tremendous effort to divorce form from content. So unreadable, there is no content, but there is beautiful form, right? In addition, Xu Bing's Book from the Sky best represents the shift from a collective movement to individual artistic experiments. As you probably know, Xu Bing's printed books and scrolls are unreadable even by native Chinese because all the characters are fake. But the book's composition, printing, and binding are strictly traditional. So that's sort of the print, a very typical kind that he reconstructed this Ming Dynasty printing sequence. That is one exhibition. So let me just maybe talk about that picture. In the first exhibition of this work in 1988 in Beijing, multiple copies of books lay on the floor in rows. Large paper sheets printed with the same characters covered walls and hung from the ceiling. Although the visual impact of the work, the Book from the Sky, is instantaneous, the project's prime significance lies in its painstaking creation over the course of several years. I would say this work, although people say beautiful or something even, but the real meaning is located in the time it wasted in a way. Xu Bing himself discussed the meaning of such a wasted time in a 1989 essay, which contains one very interesting anecdote. So I read this anecdote. He wrote, "One of my painter friends once told me about a crazy guy in his home village who always went out to collect waste paper at a certain hour, washing the piece of waste paper in a river, carefully mounting them piece by piece, and then storing them under his bed after they had become dry and flat. I thought quite a long time about this person's behavior. Finally, I realized it is a kind of qi gong, exercising qi, the traditional thing, a kind of cultivation of the Tao. It was indeed a very powerful kind of qi gong. It exemplifies an Eastern way of achieving true knowledge, obtaining sudden enlightenment, not prolonged, not evolution, but sudden enlightenment and the correspondence with nature by endlessly experiencing a fixed point and a fixed emptiness. So he sort of this, he used this anecdote, I believe, is allude to this process, because exactly do the meaningless things every day, carving over the meaningless characters for 3 years. Then finally, probably is a certain enlightenment. Here we find a radical difference between Xu Bing and the advocates of the 85 Art New Wave. So we have these theoreticians and the critics and the Xu Bing himself hiding in his little dorm, carving these characters for 3 years. So this group of theoreticians, many of them my friends, and we talk about these issues. So I'm not criticizing. They were doing wonderful things, but there were quite a different position. So they envisioned the New Wave as a grand historical movement with a universal agenda for this group. But Xu Bing constructed an interior time and space through meaningless repetition. The idea of evolution was rejected here. Instead, he imagined a moment of private enlightenment outside the flow of history. But here you have to insert Chinese history back into this grand history of modern art. But here he tried to take him away from this undertaking. So there was actually, there's a conflict between Xu Bing and some other people in 80s. But Xu Bing actually represents an entire different branch. Now we don't find in this kind of historical writing. So now we are looking back, probably we can do something about it. Suspicious of a literary meaning, you can see here, book from sky renders the text empty, but emphasize the formal beauty of the book. But Huang Yongping, another very important figure in early this period, Huang Yongping's 1987 installation destroyed form and content together. The work is called The History of Chinese Art and Concise History of Modern Painting After 2 Minutes in the Washing Machine. So as the title indicates, Huang Yongping machine washed 2 art history books. The first was by the senior Chinese art historian Wang Bomin, and had been widely used as a standard textbook in Chinese art schools. The second book, The Concise History of Modern Art, by British art critic and historian Herbert Reed, was one of the few introductions to Western art available at the time, and was widely known among these new wave artists. Actually, a lot of people read this book and copied the pictures. The Huang Yongping throw it in a washing machine. But here is a very interesting 2 books, not just 1 book. So putting these 2 books together through a 2-minute cycle in a washing machine, Huang Yongping produced a pile of paper pulp as his response to enigma that had preoccupied generations of Chinese intellectuals and artists, how to position themselves between tradition and modernity, and between East and West. So from like 19th century, people just kept asking this kind of question, East, West, modern tradition, modern tradition. Instead of providing another idealistic solution, Huang challenged the premise of the question by eliminating the binary concept altogether. No lengthy debate was needed or possible from his point of view, as the joint remains of 2 books simultaneously destroyed and united histories and traditions. Another canonical work from this reflective trend in the late 80s was Wu Shanzhuan's 86 installation, Red Humor. I showed his some other work, stamps, flags. Here is a major installation, Red Humor, 1986, or early. Constructed as a windowless room, on paper and pieces of writing. It alluded to big character posters, a major form of political writing during the Cultural Revolution. So here is, but the installation didn't simply restage a vanished historical environment, because the words on the walls in this installation were no longer the revolutionary slogans fashionable during the 60s and 70s, but commercial ads that began to fill Chinese newspapers and the public space from the mid-80s. So if you read these are not really from, the form is sort of from Cultural Revolution, but a lot of words is really you see any kind of advertisement on Beijing Street from 1980s. So in Wu's simulation of a big character posters, therefore past and present, memory and reality merged into a single moment. The result was a super-historical temporality that could be recognized as the contemporary. So here, basically, I show this example just although the term contemporaneity emerged in early 90s, this practice, the artwork actually started much earlier than the lead us to reconsider this modernist movement in the 80s. So let me leap to the mid to late 1990s, the last topic. I should say that this is not how the history of contemporary Chinese art is normally told. Most books on this subject, including some of my own, I edited, but the other books, typically they divide the history of contemporary Chinese art into 80s and 90s, like 2 decades. And separate these 2 decades with the year 1989. So that is very typical kind of narrative. I have just questioned this periodization by pushing the contemporary term back to the 80s. Now I want to highlight another crucial reorientation in contemporary Chinese art, which took place from the mid to late 90s. So no serious study has been devoted to this particular period, this mid to late 90s, as most writers have focused on the early 90s that followed the Tiananmen incident. The mid-90s, however, saw a new kind of creative energy in contemporary Chinese art, including strong interest in social issues and self-representation, in representing the city and restaging historical memory, in experimenting various forms of exhibitions and creating versatile exhibition venues, and in new art forms such as performance, installation, video, photography, and site-specific art during this period. Particularly relevant to this series of my lectures, the notion of absence regained its centrality in artistic representation. In early works like 80s, you see erasure, sweeping, this emptying the meaning, a lot of things going on. But here, this idea of erasure, disappearance became a focus again. Many works from this period displayed mutilated residential houses, residential sites echoing with memories. Many works from this period displays multiple residential houses and the extensive urban ruins, empty human forms, and blurry images, faces, and historical sites echoing with memories. So it's Changcheng, the Great Wall, Tiananmen Square. This profound emptiness is, I don't have time to explain. Those are quite amazing works from this particular period, like mid-90s, early 90s. I will explain some of them, maybe. The most extreme project from this period renders the artist's own body as a mere art materials. That's one, the most gruesome one, but the idea is that the artist turned his own body into materials, had to convince doctors to operate on a healthy body. But anyway, so again, it's, this kind of destruction, self-destruction became very prevalent. All these works, all these works were created inside China. That's very important. Inside China, not for international exhibition and the market. They were shown in informal underground exhibitions, mainly to fellow artists. I have termed this reorientation a domestic term. I hope that will be more carefully studied because of its pivotal importance in understanding contemporary Chinese art during the past 15 to 20 years. Such study would be a serious undertaking involving time-consuming archival research, since many art projects and exhibitions need to be rediscovered and documented. A lot of things are not documented. Today, I can only discuss a few examples and provide a very general historical contextualization. So there are some basic trends, just show you some pictures. To some artists, this domestic term is real and biographical. For example, I talked about Dalli in my first lecture. He went to Italy in 89, but returned in 95, returned to 95 with this art called the graffiti. So that's a kind of return, domestic return. It's really, it brought back this more like an international art technique and began to transform Beijing with it. So I talked about that he always superimposed his own image, that's his own portrait, onto these urban ruins. So to be disrupted, because the ruin will be disrupted maybe next day. He also contrasts this image with new buildings and new forms. So that kind is, again, this kind of emptiness, erasure, or absence become major kind of vocabulary. So we find a very similar self-effacing attitude and suspended temporality in many other works from that period. Here is Zhang Wang's Temptation, a series of tortured figures which are actually empty shells without a real body to feel pain. So you first see like torture, contorted bodies, seems the figure are experiencing terrible pain, but then it's hollow. There's nobody to feel it. I feel it's like a fable of demolition. You demolish houses, the residents moved away. So where are the people? Where are the people? So you have the signal or sign of this destruction, but the people disappear. Sometimes Zhang Wang displays these figures in a ruined building and took photographs. The pictures recall wartime ruins, but the resemblance is deliberately superficial, because the figures are fake mannequins, and even the ruin appears as a stage set and under artificial lights. Sometimes yellow, sometimes red, just both some kind of realness and artificiality got involved. The missing subject, there's a notion of missing subject, is sometimes identified as the artist himself. Sui Jianguo's site-specific installation, the relocation of the Central Academy of Fine Arts, is the best example of this type. To make a very long story short, the Central Academy of Fine Arts, the country's top art school, was located near Wangfujing, the most famous commercial district in Beijing. In 1994, the school was informed by the city government that it had to move to a new location within the next few months because the campus was slotted for commercial development, actually sold or rented to a Hong Kong commercial realist developer. So there was some protest attempted by the teachers and students, but before long, the school's northern section, where the Department of Sculpture had its classrooms, was already demolished. The artist Sui Jianguo, then an assistant professor in that department, cleared and paved the ground of a non-existent classroom, arranged rows of empty chairs, a desk, and 2 bookcases filled with broken bricks. So that's the installation right here. this is not a protest, he said, because we are no longer there. So only tears. So again, this becomes, you see, actually many these examples. There's no subject, but rather some gestures, some remains, and emptiness. I can give you many more, just examples. Some are great. Yin Xiuzhen, a woman artist, like a mass grave of demolished houses. All the tiles were collected from the houses. She put also took picture and put on the tiles. I feel the installation in a basement really like a mass grave. Yeah. So that's an example. Rong's haunting images of ruined neighborhoods and damaged photographs. Rong, the photographer, basically looked for the leftover images on the ruins, the focused images survived, abandoned in these ruins. Song Dong's moving performance in deserted Tiananmen Square. So he went there in the midnight, New Year's Day, 86, and breathing for 40 minutes onto the pavement. So in front of his face appeared a thin layer of ice. Then he stood up and left. Now he said actually very movingly, just he turned back and saw there is a small shimmering, like a little island in the ocean of concrete. So next morning, of course, this ice disappeared as well. So there's something about the empty space, effort to injecting life into the space, and again, the disappearance. Another woman artist, Lin Tianmiao's portrait, which is stripped of personal attributes and gender identity. The same artist also transformed her own household into an opaque, imageless world. Basically, he used white string to cover everything. So, and that's the image, her hair is transformed into this enormous, like a braid, it's colorful braids. That's her body, that's her face, many. Jin Feng, writer and artist, did this work, a photograph in which he gradually blocked his image with his own writing. The writing is actually autobiography. When he writes longer, his writing actually blocks his appearance, erase his face. And then finally, Zhu Yu's work, iconoclastic performance in which he turned his own body into a site of destruction. The time is up, I think, and I still need to address a crucial question. Why? Why does the feeling of disappearance, erasure, and emptiness, absence in general, so strongly permeate these works from mid-90s to late 90s? My answer to this question, which also concludes this lecture, is that this domestic turn in the mid and late 90s emerged as a Chinese artist's response to the globalization and the commercialization of contemporary Chinese art, and as their effort to reconnect this art with the real social and political issues in contemporary China. I explained. I mentioned earlier that the 90s saw many changes in contemporary Chinese art, the most fundamental one being its transformation from a self-contained domestic art movement into a fast-growing branch of international contemporary art. In addition to increased global exposure through exhibitions and publications, many Chinese artists traveled to the West and settled down in New York, Paris, and Berlin, where they joined other international artists and directly responded to global issues. No less significant, some pictorial styles created inside China, such as political pop and cynical realism, these familiar images, were codified in the early 90s as readily recognizable brands of a contemporary Chinese art for a global audience. The success and the misunderstanding of these images and styles indicated that contemporary Chinese art was now subject to a process of a simultaneous decontextualization and recontextualization that constantly reconstructed its definition and identity. While the term contemporary Chinese art remains the same, its meaning and purpose underwent crucial changes in the global sphere. The circulation of Chinese art brought it to an international audience, but at the same time removed it from its roots and the real social engagement. Once we realize this new condition, we can understand why works created in the domestic term so sharply contrasted with those brand names of contemporary Chinese art, which were then traveling on multiple international tours. So these two were sort of, when these things were created, these works were traveling in the global space, while these works only took place inside China. Very few people knew from outside. So that's a very interesting conversation between these two trends. So taking the forms of installation, performance, and site-specific project, these domestic works had a little commercial value and didn't circulate beyond their immediate locality. Also, contrary to political pop and cynical realist paintings, these works rejected fixed iconography and the pictorial formula and gained their meanings through such rejection. Ironically, as the works of political pop and cynical realism continue to journey around the world in prolonged travel exhibitions, one of these exhibitions is called China's New Art, post-1889, originated in Hong Kong in 1983 and traveled to the West for the next 10 years, actually, this work for 10 years. So ironically, these colorful and striking images became increasingly disconnected from China's reality. What they represented to the global audience was a false sense of immediacy and rebellion. In contrast, the vacant and the incomplete images from the domestic turn were full of immediate meaning, as they were truly contemporary and self-consciously reflected upon renewed conditions of contemporaneity with a sense of urgency. In this way, they also echoed those remarkable works created some 10 years previously during the 85 New Wave movement in the late 80s, which had marked the beginning of contemporary art in China. So in this narrative, instead of seeing contemporary Chinese art as a straight line, the different period, actually we have internal dialogue. That's what I try to show. In the 80s, there are different trends, they speak to each other. In the 90s, when the art was globalized, again, there is a conversation between different positions, different space. Now, at the end of this whole lecture series, I want to briefly review the 3 lectures and highlight my main argument. A shared purpose of these lectures, as I have repeated several times, is to explore the methodological potential of reading absence. Here, absence is understood in a dialectical relationship between depicting and depicting. The general idea is that instead of providing visual information about the subjects represented, certain images, installations, and performances deliberately erase or withhold such information. Since such phenomena are seen throughout the history of world art, we need to explore the reason for creating such works as empty images and their expected reception. In my lectures, I have tried to use this approach in discussing 3 groups of examples from traditional and contemporary Chinese art. My first lecture, just to review a little bit, dealt with portable objects exemplified by the ceramic pillow and the bronze mirror. Through analyzing their forms, decoration, and the related literature, I suggested that what makes a pillow or mirror an interesting object or a thing is its implied subjectivity. In its own existence, a mirror or pillow is a permanent reminder of the missing subject. It is always waiting to be reunited with the subject, with the face in the mirror, with the head, the body on the pillow. But the reunion is always fleeting and never leaves the physical traces. The decoration on mirror or pillow doesn't fulfill such lack, but only translate desire into symbolic image. The second lecture examines 3 types of paintings created after the fall of the Ming Dynasty in 1644. These include a commemorative portrait of a courtesan, pictures of a mausoleum, the mausoleum of the founder of the Ming Dynasty, and the images of wordless steles. I try to demonstrate how these images, though deliberately empty in physical and historical specificity, conveyed complex political and psychological meanings at the time of Ming-Qing transition. The third lecture, which you just heard, provides a revisionist narrative of contemporary Chinese art in the 1980s and 1990s. In this narrative, notions and representations of absence, including erasure, emptying, and disappearance, characterize 2 transformative stages of this art and reveal the need to constantly erase consensual meaning in order to generate frustrated energy to fill new venues. Throughout these lectures, therefore, reading absence is meant to explain the tension between presence and absence as a specific artistic and art historical phenomenon, the tension, while providing a particular angle to analyze works of art. Such reading also leads to new contextual and historical interpretation. This is the basic proposal I've tried to lay out to you in this group of lectures. Thank you.